At the end of last year, it would have been very hard to imagine the changes every person and every business on the planet has had to deal with in the space of less than 12 months. From the way we deal with friends and family, from the personal liberties that we used to take for granted but are now deprived. Working from home, schooling from home, it's now the norm for many people, not a special thing. And of course, wearing face masks in shops and offices, which was once banned, is now mandatory in some places. And unfortunately, travel, not just overseas, but within our borders, has been restricted. Clearly, coronavirus has shaped every aspect of our lives, and while there have been more challenges thrown at many of us than we've experienced in a long time, there's also good news in all of this. We've realised how resilient we are, how adaptable we are to new conditions. It can be seen in how we connect with others in our community, how we go out and embrace and appreciate our liberties once we're freed up. It's made us more grateful for living in Australia, hasn't it? Still the best country in the world. But what's Australia going to look like over the next decade, or two, or three? Well, there's lots of talk about falling migration affecting our property markets and business in general. But there are also deep forces, some demographic changes, which are going to create opportunities if you understand the peaks and troughs that will be created by clumps of Australians as they transition between different life stages. And that's what I'm going to discuss today with Simon Kuestenmacher, who's one of Australia's leading demographers and social commentators. Understanding these trends will help you become a better property investor because you're going to know where the areas in the future are going to be of increased demand, of increased growth. And you're also going to understand what's going to drive these, and it won't necessarily be what drove property price growth in previous cycles. So if you're an entrepreneur or business owner, it's also going to be critical for you to understand these major demographic trends which are going to underpin future demand. And as usual, I'm going to share with you a mindset message. I'm going to explain a bit about the tall poppy syndrome. So welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
How will the next 5 years unfold? Now, that's the question a lot of people are asking, isn't it? What's going to happen to my life, my health, my job? What's going to happen to my business? And for many people listening to this podcast, they're wondering what's going to happen to our property markets? What's going to happen to the value of my home or my investment properties? Of course, nobody knows for sure. The world just seems to be in a state of chaos. And while some parts of the world are experiencing a second wave of coronavirus, other parts of the world are experiencing the beginning of a first wave, especially the poorer countries around India and that part of Asia. Add to this the state of flux of Australia's trade relationships, the world's geopolitical problems. We're living in interesting times, aren't we? But amongst this chaos, there can be some trends, some emerging trends that we can look at over the next 5 years, behaviours, opportunities that are going to flow from the various undulations in Australia's property markets. And that's what I want to talk about today with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher about how the demographic landscape is going to change. Now, as a regular guest on my podcast, you're probably aware that he's the director of the Demographics Group, director of research. He's a columnist with The Australian, and Simon's been globally recognised as a rising star in the field of data management and insights. So welcome, Simon.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now, after that long introduction, you better play up to the part. One of the themes of our regular discussions has been how demographics drive our market, not just the property markets, but business as well. So there are a lot of questions I'd like to ask you about the underlying trends, which in my mind are going to herald some opportunities regardless of what's happening to immigration levels. But let's start with the elephant in the room. Clearly, we're going to have less immigration in the short term, Simon.
Absolutely. Australia, over the last couple of decades, migration just drove everything. Because if you add more people, you sell more of anything, of everything really. So that was nice. It was a very comfortable business model. It created a couple of problems in terms of clustering transport ways, and you create a bit of congestion. You drive property markets probably up a bit too much for the like of some people. So that's the problems that we had with migration. But it's not true that we solely depend on migration for our growth, not even for population growth. Migration traditionally makes up about 60% of population growth. So even if we take migration completely out for a year or two, we'd still see population growth simply due to natural increase, which means more babies are being born than people die, of over 100,000 people per year. So somewhere around the 130,000 person mark we will be adding to Australia still. So therefore, it's really just a matter of understanding where population growth will be occurring and where we might see decline, how there will be shifts in the market.
Well, we keep talking about demographic trends. So I guess what you're suggesting is that there will be people moving to different stages of their life, requiring different accommodation, requiring different requirements for business. So I think they're the sort of areas I'd like to look at. But what's happened overseas in countries where there hasn't been strong population growth? How have their markets worked through these changing demographic shifts?
Well, as a German, I naturally have to put Germany forward as an example here. That's a country that has seen a stagnant or slightly declining population for the last really almost 3 decades now. And there have still been big growth markets within Germany. These have been big cities where the growth economies were clustered. Munich has high tech, has knowledge worker jobs. The Swabia, so this is the area around Stuttgart, has all this manufacturing, high-end manufacturing. Berlin is becoming a European metropolis. So there are growth sectors, and there are tons of declining sectors of towns that relied too heavily on industries that are declining, like low-end manufacturing, for example. And the same is playing out in Australia, where over the last couple of years, you've seen that lots of the knowledge work jobs that were added to the workforce just happened to be clustered in the CBDs of Melbourne and Sydney. And therefore, that's where the population moved to.
So as you say, half our population growth, almost half of it comes from natural growth. But as we're going to be talking about, even bigger drivers are the emerging trends, the behaviours, the opportunities that are going to flow from the undulations in the demographic landscape. Now, I know your team have divided Australians into 7 different demographic groups, and the opportunities are going to arise from understanding the peaks and troughs of these clumps of Australians as they transition into the different stages of their lives. So let's start by breaking down the different demographic groups, Simon.
If you take this group, it's really just we split the population by age group, and then we look at the different stages that people go through their life cycle. And then you understand that just the sheer mass of people in each of those stages is either declining or it is growing over the next couple of years. And then we can adjust our assumptions about the markets. For example, the first stage is quite obvious. Kids. At the start of your life, you're a kid, you go to kindy, you go to school, and you do this until you are in your late teens, really. And that is still growing. That's the important thing, is anything related to kids is growing. So whether you are selling diapers, whether you are building schools, there'll be more of this in 10 years than there is right now. That's an important truism to understand that we are adding to our economic base this way. True is also the fact that we expected, had we done this interview 6-7 months ago, we would have expected a couple more kids to be there in 10 years' time than we expect them to be now. Because due to COVID-19, we do need to make some adjustments to our population forecasts. So that's fine.
So apart from the jokes that people are saying we're going to create more babies because we're stuck at home more likely is going to be people are going to be a bit more cautious with their money. They're not going to take on other commitments of having children until they've got more certainty in their life. Would that be fair?
That is absolutely correct. So the birth rate is rather going to decline rather than increase due to COVID-19, simply because in times of economic uncertainty, you're not willing to make any risky bets. And for many couples who might be financially in dire straits, adding a kid might be seen as a risky bit. And you just say, I'm just going to wait out the crisis and add another kid, or the first kid even in 3 years' time, in 2 years' time, whatever it is. But that means that overall, we will have a couple fewer kids walking around in 10 years' time.
So the first of the demographic groups are the children. What's the next group, Simon?
The next one is the learning stage. That's when you are becoming an adult in your own right, but you have moved out of the parental home and you're entering university, you're doing TAFE, you're really still learning how to do your job in the first stages, in the early stages of your career. And that is the only stage where we are actually expecting significant impact due to COVID-19. So due to COVID-19, we expect particularly hard to be hit the people between 22 and 28. That's a traditional age group driven by migration, by skilled migration, and by international students. And they will be missing out on a couple of years of those people. So this is a relatively bad bet to bet on those. And this will largely impact players operating in the international education field. If you operate purpose-built student accommodation that are clustered around the big universities, that, for example, isn't too promising just through the sheer numbers.
I guess these people also tend to live in the CBD, and they're the first group of people moving out of home into the smaller apartments. So there could be a glut of those as we find the millennials starting to move out of their accommodation of the last little while.
Absolutely. And that's right. So usually in the first stage, in the kids stage, you live with your parents. So you live statistically speaking, you live in suburbia. Then in your learning phase, you go to university, you have your first job. So you move to where the uni or where the job is, which tends to be the inner city. So you move from suburbia to the inner city. And then the next stage after this is partnering up. So you might actually still stay in the inner city with your partner. You share a 2-bedroom apartment with your partner, and you live there for a couple of years before you decide to actually have kids. That's the building stage of the life cycle, the next phase of the life cycle. And once you reach the building stage of the life cycle, your property needs completely change. In the partnering stage, you can make do with a relatively small apartment. But in the building stage, you add a kid, you add 1.8 kids to your house. So you need probably 2 more bedrooms. You have at least one partner who's quite likely to work from home, at least occasionally. So ideally, you would like to have a separate study, so you can do all your Zoom conference calls from the comfort of your home. So you are now looking at 3 to 4 bedrooms minimum that you'd like to have in your home. And therefore, you can't find these properties in the inner city, and you then move to suburbia, to outer suburbia. You might even look regional, at regional centers that are still attached with a good rail or road connection to the capital city, because after all, your job, even though you do it from home most of the time, still has an office presence in the CBD.
Right. Moving forward, then we'll dig into this a little bit deeper. But as we're going through the demographic groups and understanding how they're going to change over the next decade or two, started with kids, then the learning, the partnering, and then they move into the building of their family and their asset-based stage, Simon.
Absolutely. And that's the stage where things are becoming really fun to market to. So people in their 40s and 50s, they have a lot of money. And they don't save money. That's the nice part, because you have kids, you have a mortgage. Every single penny that you earn goes straight back into the economy. Annoying for you, great for the country. So it's fun to market to them, because money is being turned over real quickly in these age groups. So that's good fun, and that is a big growth cohort over the next decade. Is just this 40 something, late 40s in particular, this growth cohort. So that's good. That's another big driver for the economy over the next couple of years. And you do see that from a generational perspective, the people that in the next 10 years will be in this very attractive a building stage of the life cycle where you already have a high income, where you already have kids, where you have to pay off a mortgage. These are millennials. So that means that if you're marketing, if you're targeting this stage of the life cycle, you want to be aware of what millennials value. You want to be aware that this is a generation that is really focused on gender equality, that actually does have a strong opinion about climate change, that wants to consume in a fair, sustainable way. They also, though, have a limited number of real dollars available, and so they can't just be only idealistic in their consumer behavior, if that makes sense.
So millennials were born between 1982 and 99. That makes them around 21 to 38 today. But over the next decade or so, many of them are going to get into their late 40s. So they're at this building stage. If we're talking about real estate also, they're often going to upgrade their homes as well because they can afford to, either renovating their current home, stay where they are, or moving up.
Absolutely. That's important to know, is that as a rule of thumb, you say you buy your most expensive property in your mid-40s. And then you live in there until you retire, and then you might downsize and you buy a cheaper property in a maybe a tree change or a sea change location. But so the big spenders of Australia, the people in their 40s, that is going to grow massively in numbers over the next decade. So that was always going to be there, regardless of COVID-19. So we can still benefit of this. And that's, we just have such a big millennial cohort, of course, because we invested over the last 20 years. We created this cohort due to migration, because we took in young migrants, and those young migrants will now be reaching this high spending phase of the life cycle.
Well, I remember being a little bit older than you that millennials were thought of as procrastinators. They took a gap year. I couldn't afford a gap year. They forgot to move out of their parents' home. They stayed there a bit longer. They stayed in education longer. They didn't rush off to get jobs. They settled for partners later in life. They pushed out buying their first homes later. They pushed out having their first baby later. So some of the older generations saw them as procrastinators. But what I've learned over the years is that each generation does things differently to their parents. I guess that's one of the trends we're trying to work out, how people do things differently, Simon.
And the nice thing here is procrastinating is exactly the right term, because that's what millennials have done. They're procrastinating on those things. They have not deleted those things from their vocabulary. Millennials, like every generation before them, is going to have kids, is going to move into big suburban houses, wanting, a bit of backyard. Because if you are a millennial and you were brought up by the richest generation, the baby boomer generation, you actually lived in a decent home. So you lived in a decent sized home as well. And now that you become a parent yourself, you want to replicate all the good things that you received while you were a young kid. You want to give this to your own children as well. So you're now going to replicate quite a few of the things that you've seen from your baby boomer parents. And in order to do this, you must change geographically, because these kind of homes that you have are simply not available at your current locations.
So many of these people are living in the inner suburbs or in the CBD, but I guess you're suggesting they're going to move to suburbia. And just like the baby boomers, the generations before them changed the nature of the suburbs that they moved into. How do you see millennials reshaping our suburbs?
I do think that they will have a big impact, millennials, on the way that suburbs look and feel. And this is, again, this was always going to happen, that millennials reshape the suburbs. But due to COVID-19, this reshaping will be more intense, I would argue. Millennials will want to actually live the active transport lifestyle. That means you really take the idea of the 20-minute city, which is thrown around quite a bit in urban planning circles. Quite literally, millennials will want to be able to walk or cycle to the basic functions of their life within 20 minutes. So that means you must have a shopping street available, a nice, simple things, butcher, a fruit shop, maybe a bakery. That's the kind of basics that you want. You want childcare available. There'll be more and more parents who want to be Of course, I'm becoming a parent, but I still want to be a bit of a hipster. So I do cycle my kid to kindergarten instead of driving it. All those little things will still need to be there. So therefore, we need to reshape the suburbia, particularly because public transport won't be doing the trick. Public transport will be looked down upon a bit over the next years, simply because it's perceived as unsafe in times of a pandemic. And millennials will not be willing to go to a car-based lifestyle. They'll have cars for the trips that they need a car for, but they will want to be more on active transport. That means safe cycling infrastructure, nice walking infrastructure. Make sure as a local government area that your footpaths are wide enough for 2 prams to pass. These are the basic truisms that I would expect on the built environment side. And mind you that now that particularly in Melbourne, people have lived within their 5-kilometer radius around their home for quite a while now, it really increases the importance of your local neighborhood. So your local neighborhood is meant to be functional and beautiful. And a good region will just do this, will just enable the millennial population to have this. Then, of course, and this is the ultimate goal, is can you create your local suburb in a child-friendly way? The suburbia is going to be driven by parents. Parents have kids. And can you at some stage be a parent that has confidence enough, not only in the kids, but also in the environment, the built environment, to say, you know what, little fella, you just cycle to school. You just walk to school by yourself. Can we build a city or a local suburb that does just that? I think that's the main challenge for us.
That'll be interesting, taking it back to the days when I used to walk to school, and only last night my wife was explaining how far she had to walk to school in those days. So I can see this is going to revitalise our local shopping centres that were starting to die off for the big centres which became entertainment venues as well. But there's also seeming to be, after COVID, a move to shop local, to support locals, to band together locally, Simon.
Exactly. And the nice thing is that this drive that COVID created perfectly overlaps with the concept of the 20-minute city, which has been long into the vocabulary of all local planners in Australia. So these actually fit really well together. And that's now the opportunity to actually rebuild or build a city in a way that aligns with those values. And everybody will benefit. If you take cars off the roads, the remaining cars that still have to be on the road have significantly better traffic flow. And the people who are not stuck in cars anymore, are actually way happier than they were used to. Because we do know from happiness research that you are very unhappy when you're stuck in a car. That's simply because you have this dissonance between your machine that you're sitting in can go 200 kilometers per hour and you go 12 kilometers per hour. It's this constant dissonance that makes you mad if you're in a car. So it's really bad for your mental health.
So millennials are going to move from their centrally located 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. They're going to migrate to the suburbs, but they were a bulge in the movement of in the demographic growth. Behind them are not going to be as many of the younger generations. Is this going to mean that for a while we're going to have an oversupply of the apartments that the millennials were living in before?
Absolutely. It's just a simple numbers game. If there is a big generation of 20-somethings living in the inner city in apartments and they all move out, then you'd expect the next generation to take their spots. This generation, Gen Z, is much smaller than millennials. So there are leftover spots that will drive prices down in the inner city. There'll still be millennials in the inner city, of course. But overall, that means that the inner city market is going to be flat for a while, or might even be shrinking. But it is a temporary measure, because as soon as population growth occurs again, as soon as migration really fires up the engine again, that means that the jobs that we are creating in Australia will still be those knowledge work jobs. And those knowledge jobs, they still benefit from clustering near other knowledge jobs. And these jobs tend to cluster in the inner city. So the inner city isn't dying. It is just lying down, having a nap for a while.
Now, interestingly, I can see the government pushing migration, opening the gates as soon as possible. We have to get our economy going again. We've got to get our GDP up again. And there's only so many ways you can do that. You can only spend so much on infrastructure, on government spending. You can only give out so many handouts. So for the GDP to go up, we've either got to become more productive. And I'm not sure that that's going to be something that's as easy to do in Australia. We've either got to have more exports than imports to again improve our economy. And there are some socio-political, economic, political challenges with who's going to buy our goods at the moment. Or another way, Simon, is to bring more people in who are going to spend more, earn more, pay more tax and grease the wheels of industry. So I can't see the government having any alternative but to push migration.
Oh, not at all. And mind you that we have two main streams of migration. The first stream are international students, and they are the ultimate cash cows because they bring in a lot of money because they pay an arm and a leg for their education. So that's great for us. And 1 in 6 international students eventually becomes a resident. So we cherry pick them simply because of the way that we pick our skilled migration arm. That's the second migration arm is skilled migration. And that really means that if we lack certain abilities, certain jobs, certain qualifications in Australia, we just write them on the skilled migration list and then magically, a bit like Uber Eats, they're delivered to our doorstep. That won't occur at any large scale for a while because you can only run this Uber Eats model of the skilled migration list as long as you have reasonably low unemployment rate. We now will be out of the COVID crisis with an unemployment rate of well over 10%. So we need to get the unemployment rate down first to, let's call it 7% maybe, before skilled migration really kicks back in again.
So it's really the education sector, the students that we've got to bring in. Now, we started all this, Simon, by talking about the 7 different demographic groups, and we got stuck on the millennials, and probably rightly so, because they are going to shape the design of our suburbs moving forward. The generation before them that you've called the easing generation, tell us about them.
So we roughly said that's the easing stage of the life cycle is when you are 55 to 64. So that's the later stage of your career. So you already made quite some advances in your career. If you played your cards right, you are even to decide to maybe go down to 4 days per week, spend another day on the golf course, or maybe take a month off in winter time and go to European summer for a month.
So you're making me jealous. We can't go anywhere, Simon.
That's for 2022.
Yes, we will.
So that stage of the life cycle, this is a great time to be marketing to people in this stage, because it's the only stage in the life cycle when you have both time and money. At all other stages of the life cycle, either one is missing. And that's really nice because the kids are most likely out of the home already. You're free to manage your own time. So this is a fun cohort to deal with. They are growing a bit, but not massively. But it's still a growth market, the easing stage of the life cycle. So that's good. And I always urge people, if you could cherry pick what cohort to market to, that would be it.
They've got the money, they've got the desire, and many of them are thinking about retirement down the track. So they're already putting their mind to, hey, maybe I won't have enough superannuation. I know a lot of those are our clients at Metropole Investing. Having said that, they should have done it a couple of generations beforehand because it takes a long runway to build a significant asset base. And then the next group of people you've called the retirees, and in many ways that's the baby boomers that many years ago shaped Australia, and I guess they're still going to be shaping it just because of their large numbers.
Absolutely correct. And we will have, by 2030, all baby boomers will be of retirement age. Doesn't mean that they're all retired, but it means that they are mostly out of the influence of the workforce. So there's this big cohort of baby boomers that were actually a reasonably rich cohort. So they're now retiring. And I always say to marketers, don't call it retirement. This is, even though we are calling it the retiring phase here, because you don't want to see yourself as obsolete in this way. And the baby boomers won't be doing retirement anyway near the way the previous generation have done this. So this is the my time is now generation. You want to go and spend a bit of money. You want to go on cruises. You want to go traveling. That's a really nice stage of the life cycle, particularly when you say, we start this phase at 65 and then let's call it 70, 79-ish, thereabouts. You're still of good health. So you can still travel, you can enjoy your grandchildren, you can enjoy your pension, and you don't really need to move yet. I think that's an important thing to remember, that in this phase, we talked a bit about this, that it might be smart for a baby boomer, once you're in their late 60s, to actually sell the expensive house and move to a smaller house. But it isn't occurring at any rate that we expected. And that's simply because baby boomers stay at their home for as long as they can, and they only move out once it becomes a medical necessity, essentially.
One of the trends I've noticed over the years is that baby boomers are able to do more than their parents were able to at that stage of their lives. I think part of it is that many of us were not as physically hardworking, so we haven't worn out our bodies. I think the other thing is that with health advances and other advances, people don't see ourselves moving into retirement homes, retirement villages, or even the sea change and tree change. We want to live where we are living now, but go off and enjoy our lives and do the travel. One of the requirements for baby boomers is going to be the right sort of accommodation, bigger apartments, but in probably much the same suburbs where they're currently living, so they can go to the same dentist, the same hairdresser, go and visit their grandchildren.
Absolutely. That, of course, then raises the questions of where do the grandchildren live? And do you want to relocate to be closer to family? Do you want to uproot yourself at a late stage in your life? These are all big questions that people need to ask themselves. And some people will do this. Some people will, of course, still follow the sirens calls of Queensland and will move to Noosa, will move to anywhere near the coast. That will be occurring because it's just too attractive of an area.
As you look at where the physical growth has been over the last couple of decades, we've been housing people in our inner CBDs and the towers and in the outer suburbs and the new estates, but there hasn't been as much development where most of the people are actually wanting to live, which is in those middle and I guess some of the inner ring suburbs. And that's a town planning argument that we've discussed before. But that's one of the reasons property values are holding very steadily there. One of the trends I'm seeing currently, Simon, where there are very few properties for sale in our capital cities in those regions. And that's one of the reasons that property values are holding pretty nicely, despite the economic challenges, despite the coronavirus challenges, because these baby boomers, they've got good equity in their home. There's no reason to sell up. There's no reason to move. So they just hibernate there for a while.
Exactly. And most people who have a high-priced asset to sell actually do have the time to wait it out. So if you are a baby boomer, you probably easily have a 5, 6, 7, 10-year window in which to sell your home. And if I view my life in this 10-year time frame, right now I wouldn't be selling. Right now there is a dip in the market, so that's not fun.
Sure. So, and they can afford to hold on. Then the last of the 7 demographic groups is the aging population, and we're getting more of those. We're living longer, aren't we?
Exactly. That's the 80 plus cohort. And simply because we live much longer than previous generations, this cohort is growing. And that's the time of the life cycle when you really, from a property perspective, you want to make sure that your property is accessible, because you still want to live at home independently for as long as possible. So the goal is to actually live an independent lifestyle. And in order to do this, you do need to have an accessible home, and you probably need this home to be near decent medical facilities, which rules out only the smallest of towns. But all regional centers, all capital cities are actually fall into the relevant area for the 80 plus cohort.
Well, I guess the message I wanted to discuss with you today was the fact that even though immigration is going to fall, and it will take a little time to pick up, life is going to go on in Australia post-COVID, and Australians are going to transition from one stage of their life to another. Many are going to move from the bush to the city. I guess that's a trend we didn't mention, with the younger people moving to the big smoke. Some are going to move from the city centre to the city edge, like we said. Pre-retirees are going to move from one state to another. Some are going to be motivated to get more space and serenity. But the beauty of this is life will go on. And if we understand these trends, there's going to be opportunities for investors and there's going to be opportunities for business people who understand the needs of us lucky enough to be living in Australia, Simon.
Oh, absolutely. Which is why I still have faith in Australia. There's no reason to be absolutely downtrodden about the future of Australia. Like that hasn't changed. The basic advantages of Australia are still there. Particularly considering that this is not a virus that only impacted Australia. This is a global phenomenon, and we will get this under control, even in Victoria, where both of us are based. At some stage, and then things will continue to go. We will actually reap benefits, because that's the topic for another podcast, is that we do have just Australia as a country has advantages over other countries. So we still continue to be benefiting from our geopolitical position, if you will.
No doubt about that. And if anything, we are more attractive to people from other countries, considering that despite what's gone on in Victoria, how well we've handled this situation. So thank you. I always enjoy our monthly chat, Simon. Look forward to catching up with you again real soon.
Fantastic. Catch you soon.
In a moment, I'm going to share with you my mindset message. But if you're wondering what's going to happen to property over the next shorter term, with Simon a moment ago, we talked about the long term with what's going to happen in the next decades related to the demographic shifts. But if you're wondering about the short term, if you're looking for some direction, some guidance, why not have a chat with my team at Metropole? Now, you can find out all about what we do at metropole.com.au. But in short, we don't sell property. We give strategic advice to our clients in a number of ways. We can put together a strategic plan for you. Of course, we've got a buyer's agency, Australia's largest buyer's agency. We have wealth advisory, property management, renovations, development, financial planning. But what's more important is we can give you a level of safety and security by working with a team that has been involved in over $3.5 billion worth of property transactions. You're going to have the comfort of working with a team that currently manages over $2 billion worth of assets for clients. So we know what works and we know what doesn't work. If you're wondering, is the worst over? What's going to happen to our property markets? How do I find an investment that's going to get me to where I want to get to without taking risks? Go to metropole.com.au, leave us your details, and I'd love to be part of your wealth creation journey.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In today's mindset message, I'd like to read to you a post that Ron Malhotra put on LinkedIn, and it was about people who knock those who are already wealthy, that are successful. I see this on the internet a lot, where there are a lot of people looking to find fault in those who've climbed the top of the mountain, who are wealthy already. They say it's an unworthy cause. Anyway, let me read you what he said. He said, most people who attack wealth have never actually learned what it takes to create wealth. Ron said, instead of learning how to make sacrifices to create wealth, they prefer to throw stones at those who've already created wealth. He went on to say, I believe you've only earned the right to say financial wealth is not worth it after you've created wealth. Otherwise, you're simply justifying your lack of willingness to make sacrifices by attaching honour to not wanting wealth. He said, if you're so honourable, why don't you just make a lot of wealth and give it away? That'd be a true test of your benevolence. Ron said, don't forget, charities get most of their money from those who have wealth, not from those who deny its importance. Those at the base camp should never say it's not worth climbing the mountain. Only those who've reached the top of the mountain have earned the right to say that. And you'll rarely hear them say that. So Ron Malhotra said, I've been on both sides, so I know what it's like, and I feel qualified to talk about this. So stop making excuses and start making sacrifices. I hope you got some benefit from the 2 segments in today's show, from the chat I had with Simon and from my recent mindset discussion. If you did get some benefit and you know somebody else who'd benefit from them, tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast, or you can tell the world by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Spotify, or wherever you listen to this. And if I read out your review, as I'm about to for Annie Blackshaw, I'd be thrilled to say thank you by gifting you one of my books. Annie left a review recently saying a gem for Australian investors. I think it was a 5-star review too, and she said Michael shares his personal and business wisdom on the podcast. He and his guests offer very rational insights from a wealth of business and investment experience. Tuning in regularly keeps me motivated. Thanks for producing such an incredible and free resource. Well, it's my pleasure, Annie. And if you email me, michael@metropole.com.au, I'd love to say thank you by gifting you one of my books. Now, I'll be back again real soon, twice a week with the Michael Yardney podcast. But in between, you can catch me on social media. Just look out for Michael Yardney. I'd love to see what you're up to, and maybe you can find out what I've been up to. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?